Michael gripped the steering wheel of his aging bus, the hum of the engine a familiar lullaby after a 12-hour shift driving through the city's veins. It was past midnight, the streets slick with rain reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. His eyes heavy with exhaustion caught a figure huddled under a flickering lamppost in the rough part of town where even the bravest avoided lingering. She was young, her dark hair plastered to her face, her thin jacket no match for the downpour. Michael's first instinct was to keep driving home to Ava, his 7-year-old daughter, who was probably curled up with her stuffed rabbit under a quilt. But something about the woman's trembling shoulders, the way she hugged herself against the cold, made him pull over. He stepped out, rain soaking his worn jacket, his boots splashing in puddles as he approached her. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, his voice low but steady, not wanting to scare her. She flinched, her eyes wide with defiance and fear, snapping, "I don't need your help." Michael stayed calm, his hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not saying you do, but it's pouring, and it's not safe out here at this hour." Her lips quivered, her gaze darting down the empty street, like she expected trouble to emerge from the shadows. "I got mugged," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They took my bag, my phone, everything." Michael's jaw tightened. He knew this neighborhood's dangers too well. He thought of Ava alone with the babysitter and the risks of inviting a stranger into their lives. But the woman's eyes held a mix of pride and desperation that reminded him of his own sleepless nights after his wife left. "I live a few blocks away," he said, adjusting his cap as rain dripped from the brim. "It's not much, but it's dry and safe. You can stay on the couch just for tonight." "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Michael shrugged. "Because if Ava ever needed help, I'd hope someone would offer her a hand." She looked away, her breath shaky, then nodded faintly. "Okay, just one night." They walked to his bus in silence, Michael keeping a respectful distance, his eyes scanning the dark for threats. At his small apartment he unlocked the door, revealing a cluttered but warm space, a faded couch, a pile of Ava's coloring books. He pointed to a mat by the door. "Shoes, their couch is yours, I'll grab a blanket." She stepped inside, her movements cautious, like she was stepping into a foreign world. Michael handed her a towel and a faded hoodie, his wife's old one never thrown out. "Bathrooms down the hall, water's slow to heat," he said, then paused. "I'm Michael, by the way." She nodded, clutching the towel. "Sophia." He didn't press for more, instead, leaving a mug of tea on the coffee table with a note. Landlines on the wall, blankets in the closet. As he slipped into Ava's room to check on her sleeping form, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. But Sophia's quiet "thank you" as she curled onto the couch echoed in his mind, a small spark of trust in a cold night. Sophia woke to the soft clatter of dishes and the scent of brewing coffee, her body stiff from the lumpy couch, but wrapped in a warmth she hadn't felt in days. The apartment was bathed in pale morning light, filtering through thin curtains. She sat up, the oversized hoodie Michael had given her slipping off one shoulder, and noticed a small girl with messy curls kneeling on the carpet, arranging plastic blocks into a wobbly castle. The girl looked up, her eyes bright with unguarded curiosity, and grinned. "Hi, you're the rainy lady who slept on our couch," she said, her voice high and cheerful. "I'm Ava, I'm 7, and I made this castle for my bunny." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the child's warmth, and managed a small smile. "Nice castle, Ava. I'm Sophia." Before she could say more, Ava bounded over, holding out a stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear. "This is Mr. Flops. He likes you." Sophia hesitated, unused to such open affection, then gently patted the rabbit's head, her throat tightening at the innocence of it. From the kitchen, Michael called out, "Ava, don't overwhelm our guest. Come help with breakfast." His voice was gentle but firm, and Ava giggled, scampering off. Sophia stood, stretching her aching limbs, and followed the sound of sizzling bacon. The kitchen was cramped, with a chipped table and mismatched chairs, but it felt like the heart of the home. Michael stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a practiced hand, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows. "Morning," he said, without turning. "Hope you're okay with slightly charred pancakes. It's kind of a tradition here." Sophia leaned against the doorway, her guard still up but softening. "I've had worse," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. Michael glanced over with a half-smile. "That's the spirit. Grab a plate if you're hungry." Ava tugged at Sophia's sleeve, pulling her to the table, and soon they were all seated. Ava chattering about her favorite cartoon, while Michael served lopsided pancakes and bacon that was more crisp than intended. Sophia took a bite. Between Ava's giggles and Michael's quiet jokes about his cooking skills, Sophia felt a flicker of something she hadn't laughed in weeks, not since the night she fled her father's world of cold marble and colder expectations. As they ate, Michael mentioned a diner down the street owned by a friend, Rosie, who was always looking for extra hands. "It's not glamorous," he said, wiping syrup from Ava's chin, "but it's honest work. Could help you get back on your feet if you're sticking around." Sophia tensed, her fingers tightening around her fork. She hadn't planned to stay, hadn't planned anything beyond escaping the suffocating life she'd left behind. But the thought of leaving this small, messy haven made her chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. "I don't know how long I'll be here," she said carefully, "but I could use the money." Michael nodded, no judgment in his eyes, just a quiet understanding that made her feel seen without being exposed. After breakfast, he walked her to the diner, Ava skipping ahead, clutching Mr. Flops. The diner was a relic of another era, with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hummed old soul tunes. Rosie, a woman with grey streaks in her hair and a smile, sized Sophia up and handed her an apron. "You look like you can handle a rush," Rosie said, tossing her a notepad. "Start now, we'll see how you do." Sophia fumbled through her first shift, spilling coffee and mixing up orders, but the regulars were kind, their laughter easing her nerves. By noon, her feet ached, but she felt a strange pride in the tips jingling in her apron pocket money. She'd earned, not inherited. Back at the apartment that evening, Ava insisted on showing Sophia her secret treasure box, a shoebox filled with shiny pebbles, a broken watch, and a drawing of a rainbow. "You can add something if you want," Ava said, her eyes wide with hope. Sophia hesitated, then tucked a folded paper napkin from the diner into the box, earning a beaming smile from Ava. As the girl ran off to play, Michael leaned against the counter, watching Sophia with a quiet intensity. "You did good today," he said. Sophia looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, unsure how to handle the sincerity. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, "people being kind without wanting something." Michael's expression softened, but he didn't push. "You'll get used to it," he said simply, then turned to wash the dishes. That night, as Sophia lay on the couch, the sound of Ava's soft snores drifting from the bedroom, she stared at the ceiling, the weight of her old life pressing against the fragile piece she'd found here. She didn't know how long she could stay, but for the first time, she wanted to. Sophia's hands were raw from scrubbing dishes at Rosie's diner. The work was relentless, a blur of coffee refills, shouted orders, and grease-stained aprons, but it anchored her in a way she hadn't expected. Each dollar in her pocket felt like a small victory, a tether to a life she was building, not inheriting. Over the past week, she'd settled into a rhythm with Michael and Ava, sharing quiet evenings in their cluttered apartment, where the hum of a second-hand radio mingled with Ava's giggles over board games. Michael's steady presence was a comfort, his dry humor cutting through her guardedness, while Ava's unfiltered affection chipped away at the walls Sophia had built around her heart. She found herself lingering at the kitchen table after dinner, helping Ava with her spelling homework, or listening to Michael recount stories of his bus routes, his voice warm with a resilience that made her own troubles feel less heavy. But her past was a shadow she couldn't outrun. One humid afternoon, as she folded napkins in the diner's back booth, a small velvet pouch slipped from her duffel bag, spilling onto the table. Inside was a locket, its silver surface etched with delicate vines, a single emerald glinting in the center. Sophia's breath caught, her fingers freezing as she stared at the heirloom she'd meant to keep hidden. It was a gift from her father, Victor Langley, a token from a life of gilded cages she'd fled. Before she could shove it back into her bag, Michael appeared, wiping his hands on a rag after helping Rosie fix a leaky faucet. His eyes landed on the locket, and he paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's not something you pick up at a thrift store," he said, his tone curious but not accusing. Sophia's heart raced, her fingers closing around the locket. "It's just an old thing I forgot about," she mumbled, shoving it into her pocket. Michael studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but unintrusive, then nodded and turned back to the faucet, letting the moment pass. But the air between them felt heavier, her secrecy a quiet wedge. Later that evening, as they walked home with Ava skipping ahead, clutching a library book about dinosaurs, Sophia felt the weight of the locket in her pocket like a confession she wasn't ready to make. At the apartment, Ava insisted on a family movie night, piling blankets on the couch and demanding Sophia sit next to her. The girl's small hand curled into Sophia's as they watched a cartoon about a lost fish, and Sophia's chest tightened with a longing she couldn't name. After Ava fell asleep, her head resting on Sophia's lap, Michael carried her to bed, leaving Sophia alone in the dim living room. She traced the edge of the couch, thinking of the mansion she'd left behind, its sterile halls, her father's cold expectations, the fiancé chosen for her, a man who saw her as a transaction. Here, in this cramped space, she felt something new, a sense of being wanted, not owned. When Michael returned, he sat across from her, his hands clasped loosely. "Ava's attached to you," he said quietly. "She asked if you're staying forever." Sophia's throat tightened, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of the hoodie. "I don't know what forever looks like," she admitted. "I've never had to think about it before." Michael leaned forward, his eyes kind but searching. "You don't have to have it all figured out, but if you're running from something, you might want to tell me enough so I can keep Ava safe." His words weren't a demand, but they carried the weight of a man who'd lost too much to take risks. Lightly, Sophia wanted to tell him about the father who controlled her every move, the wealth that suffocated her, the night she'd walked away with nothing but a bag and a locket, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded, promising herself she'd find a way to open up before her past caught up. The next day at the diner, as she poured coffee for a regular, Ava burst in after school, her backpack bouncing as she waved a drawing of 3 stick figures labeled Daddy, Me, Sophia. "It's us," Ava declared, her grin wide. Sophia's eyes stung as she pinned the drawing behind the counter, her heart swelling with a warmth that scared her. She wasn't supposed to feel this rooted, not when she was still a stranger in her own life. That night, as she helped Michael wash dishes, their elbows brushing in the tiny kitchen, she caught him watching her with a softness that made her pulse quicken. "You're good for her," he said, his voice low, "and maybe for me too." Sophia's breath hitched, the unspoken connection between them sparking in the quiet. But the locket in her pocket felt like a ticking clock, a reminder that her past was never far behind. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sophia wiped down the counter, her hands moving mechanically while her mind churned with the weight of the locket still tucked in her pocket. It had been 10 days since she'd arrived at Michael's doorstep, a stranger soaked by rain and fear, and now the rhythm of their lives, shared meals. Ava's laughter, Michael's quiet steadiness, felt like a fragile dream she was terrified to wake from. The lunch rush had just ended, leaving the diner quiet except for the clink of dishes and Rosie's humming in the kitchen. Sophia was refilling ketchup bottles when the bell above the door chimed sharply. A man in a leather jacket stepped inside, his baseball cap pulled low, a smartphone glinting in his hand. His eyes locked onto her with a predator's focus, and her stomach dropped. "There you are, Miss Langley," he said, his voice oily with satisfaction as he raised his phone and snapped a photo. Sophia froze, the ketchup bottle slipping in her grip, her heart hammering as the name she'd tried to bury echoed in the air. Before she could speak, Michael emerged from the back, his apron streaked with grease from helping Rosie with a fryer. He took one look at the man, then at Sophia's pale face, and stepped between them, his shoulders squared. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low but unyielding. The man smirked, snapping another photo. "Just doing my job, pal. Her daddy's got a fat reward for her whereabouts." Sophia's knees weakened, her past crashing into the present like a tidal wave. Michael moved faster, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it just enough to make him wince. "I said out," he growled, shoving him toward the door. The man stumbled but laughed, slipping outside with a taunting wave of his phone. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps. Michael turned to her, his eyes searching, not with anger but with a quiet urgency. "Sophia, who was that?" he asked, his voice softer now but firm. She swallowed, her throat tight, and glanced around the diner, where a few regulars pretended not to stare. "I need air," she managed, pushing past him toward the back exit. Outside in the alley, the air was thick with the smell of garbage and grease, but it was better than the suffocating panic inside. Michael followed, keeping his distance, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Talk to me," he said. Not a demand, but a plea. Sophia leaned against the brick wall, her fingers clutching the locket through her jeans. "I'm not who you think I am," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "My name is Sophia Langley. My father is Victor Langley, the real estate tycoon." I ran away from his world, his money, his rules, his plans for me. That man was a private investigator, probably hired to drag me back. Michael's face tightened, not with judgment, but with the weight of her words. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Sophia's eyes met his, raw and unguarded. Because for the first time in my life, I felt like I was someone, not something to be controlled. You and Avu didn't care about my last name or what I could buy. You just saw me. Michael exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes flickering with a mix of protectiveness and hurt. I get keeping secrets, Sophia, but this puts Ava at risk. I need to know what we're dealing with. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I didn't mean to lie. Michael stepped closer, his voice steady. You don't have to go back, but you can't keep running either. We'll figure this out, but we need to keep Ava safe. Sophia's chest ached at his use of we, a word that felt like a lifeline. They decided to move fast, heading to the apartment to gather a few things before taking Ava to a neighbor's house. A kind older woman named Mrs. Chen, whom Michael trusted implicitly. As they packed, Ava sensed the tension, clutching Mr. Flops tightly. Is the rainy lady in trouble? She asked, her voice small. Sophia knelt beside her, forcing a smile. Just a little adventure, kiddo. You'll stay with Mrs. Chen tonight, like a sleepover. Ava nodded but hugged Sophia tightly, her small arms fierce. At Mrs. Chen's, Michael kissed Ava's forehead, promising to be back soon, while Sophia watched, guilt gnawing at her for disrupting their lives. As they drove away in Michael's rattling truck, the city lights blurring past, Sophia felt the weight of her father's world closing in. He won't stop, she said quietly, staring out the window. My father never lets go of what he thinks is his. Michael glanced at her, his jaw set. He doesn't get to decide who you are, Sophia. No one does. His words, simple and sure, sparked something in her, a resolve to face her past, not for her father, but for the life she was starting to want with Michael and Ava. The hospital's sterile glow cast harsh shadows on Michael's face as he sat hunched in a plastic chair, his hands clasped tightly, staring at the tiled floor. Ava lay in the bed before him, her small frame dwarfed by the crisp white sheets, her cheeks flushed with a fever that had spiked overnight. The cough she'd had for days had worsened, her breathing labored, and Michael's heart twisted with every ragged gasp she took. He'd carried her to the truck at midnight, her body burning against his chest. And now, in the early hours, the hospital's bureaucracy loomed as a new threat. The nurse at the desk had been kind but firm. A $5,000 deposit was required for Ava's admission, and Michael's wallet held barely enough for a week's groceries. He'd pleaded, his voice cracking, promising to pay in installments, but the hospital's policy was unyielding. His mind raced, calculating shifts he could pick up, possessions he could sell, anything to keep Ava safe. The weight of being her only anchor, the only one she had since her mother walked out, pressed against his chest like a physical force. He was still arguing with the nurse when a familiar voice cut through the chaos. I'll cover it. Sophia stood in the hallway, her coat damp from the drizzle outside, her eyes steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She didn't wait for Michael's reaction, striding to the desk and sliding a credit card across the counter. Put everything on this room. Meds, tests, all of it, she said, her voice calm but resolute. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Michael, then asked, relation to the patient. Sophia looked at him, her gaze softening. Family, she said simply. Michael's throat tightened, his pride warring with gratitude as the nurse processed the payment and led them to Ava's room. An hour later, the doctor delivered cautious good news. Ava had a severe viral infection, treatable with medication and rest, but she'd need to stay for observation. Michael sat by Ava's bedside, his hand gently holding hers, her small fingers limp against his calloused palm. Sophia lingered by the door, giving him space but watching the scene with a quiet intensity. When Ava stirred, murmuring for water, Sophia fetched a cup without a word, her movements careful, almost reverent. As Ava sipped, her eyes fluttering shut again, Michael finally looked at Sophia, his voice low and raw. You didn't have to do that. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. I know, but I wanted to. He exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the night. I can't pay you back, Sophia, not anytime soon. She shook her head, her eyes fierce. It's not about money, Michael. It's about Ava. The silence between them was heavy but not strained, filled with the soft beeping of Ava's monitor. Michael's gaze drifted to his daughter, then back to Sophia, and for the first time, he saw her not as a stranger he'd helped, but as someone who'd chosen to stay, to step into their lives when she could have walked away, before he could speak. The door swung open, and a tall figure filled the frame. Victor Langley, Sophia's father, his tailored coat and silver hair stark against the hospital's drab walls. His presence was like a cold wind, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Sophia. "Enough of this," he said, his voice clipped. "You've had your little rebellion, Sophia. It's time to come home." Michael stood instinctively, positioning himself between Sophia and Victor, his protective stance automatic. Sophia rose too, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "This is my home now, Dad, not your penthouse, not your rules." Victor's gaze flicked to Michael, then to Ava's sleeping form, his lip curling slightly. "You think this man, this life, can give you what I can? Security, status, a future?" Sophia stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "He's given me more than you ever did: dignity, trust, a place where I'm not a pawn in your empire." Victor's face hardened, but there was a flicker of something else: regret, perhaps, or recognition of a fight he was losing. "You're throwing everything away," he said, his voice quieter now. Sophia shook her head, her voice breaking but firm. "I'm choosing everything that matters." Michael watched, silent, his heart swelling with a mix of awe and fear. Victor turned to him, his gaze assessing. "You think you can protect her from the world?" Michael met his eyes, unflinching. "I'll protect her from anyone who tries to take her choices away." Victor stood motionless for a long moment, then turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Sophia sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face, and Michael reached out, hesitating before resting a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm free," she whispered, and the word carried a weight that filled the room. As they sat together, watching Ava's chest rise and fall, Sophia realized she hadn't just fought for herself. She'd fought for the life she was building, one where love was the currency, not control. 2 months had passed since the hospital, and the crisp autumn air now carried the scent of fallen leaves and grilled corn as Sophia stood at a makeshift food cart in the bustling city park. The cart, a repurposed trailer hitched to Michael's old truck, bore a hand-painted sign, "Ava's Eats." It was Sophia's idea, born from late-night talks with Michael about building something of their own, something that could sustain them without chaining them to endless shifts. The cart served simple fare breakfast burritos, blueberry muffins, and strong coffee made with recipes they'd perfected in Michael's tiny kitchen. Today, the park was alive with families, dogs chasing frisbees, and kids shrieking on swings, their laughter mingling with the sizzle of Sophia's griddle. She flipped a burrito with a practiced flick, her apron streaked with salsa, and caught Michael's eye as he handed change to a customer. He grinned, mouthing "nice one," and her heart lifted, a quiet joy settling into her bones. Ava, perched on a stool, handed out napkins and homemade stickers, brightly colored drawings of smiling tacos and muffins, her curls bouncing as she chatted with customers. "This one's for you. It's a happy burrito," she told a beaming elderly woman. Sophia watched, her chest swelling with a warmth that felt like home, a stark contrast to the cold marble halls of her father's world. She'd walked away from Victor Langley's empire for good, choosing instead this messy, vibrant existence. The cart wasn't making them rich, but it was enough to pay the bills, to keep Ava in new sneakers, to let Michael cut back on his grueling bus shifts. More than that, it was theirs, built on sweat and laughter, not inherited wealth. As the lunch rush slowed, Sophia leaned against the cart, wiping her brow, and Michael joined her, offering a cold bottle of water. "We're getting pretty good at this," he said, his voice warm with pride. Sophia smiled, nudging his shoulder. "You doubted my burrito skills." He chuckled, shaking his head, and for a moment they stood in comfortable silence, watching Ava chase a butterfly across the grass. Sophia thought back to the night she'd returned to Michael's apartment, a brown paper bag of muffins in her hands, her heart pounding as she'd said, "I'm here to stay, if you'll have me." Michael's answer had been a quiet nod, his eyes soft with a trust that felt like a promise. Since then, they'd woven their lives together, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady acts. Sophia, braiding Ava's hair before school, Michael teaching her to balance a checkbook, the three of them planting a tiny herb garden on the apartment's fire escape. It wasn't perfect. There were late bills, burnt muffins, and moments when Sophia's past crept into her dreams, whispering doubts about whether she'd made the right choice. But then she'd wake to Ava's giggles, or Michael's hand brushing hers over a sink full of dishes, and the doubts would fade. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park, a familiar figure approached the cart. Mrs. Chen, their neighbor, who'd watched Ava during that tense night when Sophia's past had come knocking. She ordered a coffee, her eyes twinkling as she leaned in. "You three make a good team," she said, glancing at Ava, who was now drawing on a napkin with a customer's kid. Sophia felt a lump in her throat, realizing how much this community had become her anchor. Later, as they packed up the cart, Ava tugged at Sophia's sleeve. "Can we make dinosaur pancakes tomorrow?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Sophia laughed, kneeling to meet her gaze. "Only if you help with the shapes, kiddo." Ava nodded enthusiastically, then threw her arms around Sophia, hugging her tight. "I'm glad you're our rainy lady," she whispered. Sophia's eyes stung as she hugged her back, feeling Michael's quiet presence beside them. That night, back at the apartment, they sat on the couch, Ava sprawled across their laps, asleep with Mr. Flops clutched to her chest. The TV played softly, a documentary about whales, but neither Sophia nor Michael was watching. "Do you ever miss it?" Michael asked, his voice low, his fingers tracing the edge of a throw blanket. "The money, the fancy life." Sophia shook her head, her gaze settling on Ava's peaceful face. "I had everything, mansions, cars, trips, but it was empty. This," she gestured to the cramped room, the chipped mugs on the coffee table. "This is full of you, Ava, us." Michael's hand found hers, his touch warm and steady, and for the first time, Sophia felt no need to run. She'd found her place, not in a palace, but in a life built on kindness, resilience, and love, a home that loved her back.